I'm Leo Walder for Kit Guru. This is the Z370 Aorus Gaming 7 motherboard from Gigabyte. I use this motherboard for my launch review of Intel Coffee Lake. That's the 8th gen Core i7 8700K and also the i5 8400. But we didn't really focus too much on the motherboard, although we did look at overclocking with it at that point. Here we're going to take a closer look. The thing about this particular motherboard is Z370 chipset is everything we know about Z270 for Kaby Lake. It basically applies because it's basically the same chipset. The difference is that it's locked out, so you can only use an Intel 8th gen processor, more cores. In terms of how it affects a motherboard from the end user's point of view, honestly, it appears to be pretty much the same thing. The motherboard manufacturers tell us they've had to do more power for the extra cores. Fine, entirely understandable. But from the end user point of view, if I was to cover up the name with a bit of tape, I wouldn't know it wasn't Z270, which is okie dokie. What that means is we've got features that are almost entirely familiar, a layout that is entirely familiar, and a few tweaks here and there and bits of polishing that make it Z370 rather than Z270. Honestly though, same thing. So, to all intents and purposes, it's a high-end Kaby Lake motherboard, except it supports Coffee Lake. That's a good thing. There is also an awful lot of RGB going on. I mean, it's totally unmissable. All the expansion slots are glowing like crazy. The heat sinks around on the VRMs and the power distribution hardware, and also the memory slots. Loads of RGB. Chosen for this a simple flashing red just because it's less annoying. But you've got all sorts of effects, as I'll show you shortly. Controllable at a basic level within the UEFI BIOS. If you want to do fine control and pick some of the more funky functions, you need to go into Windows and use the particular RGB app, which is one of my gripes actually, but I'll come to that in time as well. Next to the CPU socket, exactly where you'd expect, there are 4 DDR4 memory slots, dual channel support obviously. They go up to 4133 MHz on this board. Lesser models go very slightly slower in the Aorus range. So this is the premium model. You're getting the absolute tip-top clock speeds. If the difference between 4133 and 4000 and 3866 matters a great deal to you, absolutely fine, this is the model to go for. You get 3 M.2 slots, 2 that are exposed, albeit one is covered by the EVGA graphics card, and one that's covered by a heat spreader which has some thermal pads inside to transfer heat from your SSD. That M.2 is in the ideal position because it's north of the graphics card, so it's between the CPU socket and the graphics card, which means you've got a decent chance of getting some cooling air to it, whereas the slots that are further south are shrouded by the graphics card or graphics cards, and therefore in terms of cooling they have a harder job. That top slot is absolutely the ideal position. We like that. The layout is conventional in that the 2 PCI Express times 16 slots at the top, they're fed from the CPU, so if you have one graphics card it gets the full times 16. If you install 2 graphics cards or some other form of storage device, the PCI Express is split, so times 8 times 8. The third mechanical times 16 slot gets 4 lanes of PCI Express. They come from the chipset. The times 1 slots are also powered from the chipset. You do get into some detail whereby the slots double up with the SATA ports. So if you populate all the slots and if you populate the M.2s, you're going to start killing off SATA connections. Conversely, if your SATA ports are populated, they will start to disable some of the PCI Express. The odds that you're going to want to populate them all is just non-existent. But you cannot populate everything that you see. You are almost certainly going to lose a couple of SATA ports along the way. Having said that, you've got 6 SATA ports. That's 3 or 4 more than most people will need, and you're certainly going to have a couple spare. No cause for concern there whatsoever. The power distribution is interesting. It's 10-phase power, 8+2. The hardware is by Intersil, which is not Gigabyte's or Aorus's usual supplier. We understand that this is due to tightness in supply of certain components in Taiwan. These are actually very high-end, very expensive components, which seem entirely appropriate in this motherboard. They're also rated extremely highly. Temperature overload won't kick in until they reach about 135 or 140 degrees C. At that point, the CPU will start to throttle. We saw temperatures nowhere approaching that, and indeed there is in the I/O panel a tiny little 40mm fan which has simply not stirred during all my testing. Having said that, I'm working on Open Test Bench, and as you can see, the Fractal Design Celsius S24 liquid cooler is mounted on the end of my Streacom test bench, so it's drawing air through the radiator and therefore across the CPU socket. So there is some air movement around the VRM heatsinks. If you plug in your Core i7 8700K out of the box, it runs at 4.3 gigahertz on all cores, and this particular motherboard feeds it 1.16 volts. The power draw is very reasonable. It idles at 45 or so watts, and then when you put the thing under load, stressing the CPU, not the GTX 1080 Ti, it only draws 140 watts in Cinebench, 150 watts in AIDA64. The Seasonic Prime Titanium 1000 watt under there was not working hard at this stage in the game, that's for certain. Temperatures are absolutely fine, so the CPU idled at 24, and then under those CPU loads 56 or 62 depending on what exactly I was doing. Let's call it 60 and round money, so no problem whatsoever. When you overclock, and I went down the easy route as I did with the launch review, if you simply use the automatic process within the UEFI and you pick the maximum speed for this process, you can have 4.8, 4.9 and 5.0. I pick 5.0, bang, up with the multiplier, leave the voltage on auto, and it feeds it 1.4 volts, at which point the idle power draw goes up very slightly to 50. The loaded power draw goes up by 80 or 90 watts, so now we're talking 235 watts under CPU load, not GPU load, just CPU load, and it behaves absolutely admirably. But now the CPU temperatures, depending on what you're doing, so in Cinebench 80 degrees and in AIDA64 89 degrees. If you're starting to use Prime and all those sorts of things, you'll very likely get into blue screen territory. So 5 gigahertz for this CPU is, depending on what you're doing, either perfectly okay or a little bit beyond the pale. And that's the end of the overclocking. It's just so straightforward. 1.4 volts is absolutely fine, and there's no point in feeding it more power because the CPU can't handle it. If you're delidding it and you're using a liquid metal or some such, you're in different territory. But with a stock CPU, you don't need to do any of that. More power, bump up the multiplier, job done. Absolutely fine, and the CPU is the limit. So overclocking could not be easier. I had no concerns about the cooling on the VRMs whatsoever. Having said that, the VRM heatsinks do appear to me to be, at least in part, carriers for all the RGB lighting. There's an awful lot of shrouding on top of some reasonable sized VRM heatsinks, but they are not as large as they first appear. I am not personally concerned about that, but if you think you're getting massive, great chunky heatsinks, I'm going to say no, you're not. It's a bit of an optical illusion. One feature of the Aorus Gaming 7 that is a striking success is Smart Fan 5. Aorus has taken the decision to allow each fan header to be configured for whatever fan you connect to it. You don't get 3-pin, 4-pin, this, that and the other. You get fan headers. You plug in a fan, it goes, right, I know what I'm doing here, and you're good to go. You can do almost all the configuration that you want in the UEFI BIOS rather than using the System Information Viewer app in Windows. So that's the way I chose to work, which was within the UEFI, which is a perfectly decent piece of software. Sometimes Aorus and Gigabyte can be a bit clunky, mouse control and so on, not necessarily the greatest. It works absolutely fine, certainly well enough to deliver a good result. Other features on the board that are good: you've got dual Ethernet, you've got headers for USB 3.1 Gen 1 and also for Gen 2. You've got micro buttons for overclocking, power and reset. Going down the ports and connectors on the I/O, we've got a lot to look at. So there's a conventional PS2 for an old style mouse and keyboard. We've got a couple of USBs which are yellow in colour. They are ideally for your gaming headset. We've got HDMI and DisplayPort for the internal graphics. I can't imagine who's going to use the internal graphics from the Intel processor rather than using a proper graphics card. It just seems extraordinary to me. But there we have it. Having said that, if they didn't include the graphics connectors, I'll probably complain, so they can't really win. Then moving along, we've got more blue USB 3.0s. We've got a blue USB 3.0 and then a red USB 3.1 Gen 2. USB 3.0 Blue is often referred to these days as 3.1 Gen 1s. That can get confusing. We've got a bunch of audio jacks connected to the Realtek audio chip. That's an ALC 1220, 7.1 audio, so all the usual good stuff. We've got a pair of Ethernets. They're both gigabit. One is Intel, the other is Rivet Networks Killer E2500. And around here we have two USB 3 headers, one being Gen 1, so USB 3.0 in my parlance, and one USB 3.1 Gen 2. As to what you're going to use that port for right now, I'm not entirely sure, but as soon as cases in particular support that, it'll be ready to go. That strikes me more as future-proofing than anything else at this precise moment. Things I like about this motherboard basically boil down to the hardware. I like the hardware, the layout is all good. I don't have any quibbles about that whatsoever. I'm less impressed by the software that Aorus uses, or more accurately, the approach that Aorus takes with its software. So you first have to install their Gigabyte Aorus App Center, and then you can download and install the various bits of software that are appropriate to your particular motherboard. The software for this motherboard, 3D OSD, App BIOS, which is their updating BIOS piece of software, BIOS setup, Cloud Station, Easy Tune, Fast Boot, Game Boost, On-Off Charge, Platform Power Management, RGB Fusion, Smart Backup, Smart Keyboard, Smart Time Lock, System Information Viewer, USB Blocker and VTuner. USB Blocker, for example, is perfectly solid. That allows you to lock out USB devices so no one can come along and plug something into your system that shouldn't be plugged in. No problem with that whatsoever. It just seems a bit curious to do it in Windows. Cloud Station, I don't know if I want to use anything to do with cloud whatsoever to do with my motherboard. System Information Viewer, yeah, fine, but all that sort of thing I can do within the UEFI, so I don't feel any need to have that in Windows whatsoever. Similarly, at BIOS, the business about updating when you're in Windows, yeah, that's all right, but again, within the UEFI works for me. And that's the thing, most of these things you can do within the UEFI or within Windows. And the thing is, I found, for example, RGB Fusion just didn't work as well in Windows. You get more options and it just isn't as straightforward to use, to my mind, whereas doing it in the UEFI is just an absolute doddle. So I really wish that the software was better. I wish it was one unified whole. The idea you have to install a thing and then more things and then have it forever shrieking at you about updates and attempting to get you to install Norton antivirus, I think it was. I like this motherboard. It's a good motherboard. It has a load of good hardware. It's laid out properly. The UEFI works. The software I'm not so wowed about, but I can live with it. There are very few negative points. I'm not completely impressed by the way the VRM heatsinks act as carriers for all the RGB. But if you really don't want the RGB, you can always just turn it off. That's not a problem. And the VRM heatsinks do work correctly. So no actual problems. It just seems a bit shiny. I'm not hugely taken by the way that you cannot populate all the SATA connections and all the PCI Express and all the M.2s without something going dark on you, but realistically that's always going to be the case, so that's fine. I mean, the manual is reasonably clear on the subject. You're not going to be caught on the hop. If you really truly want 6 SATA devices, 3 M.2s and to populate all the slots, I don't know what it is you're doing with this motherboard, so you have to decide which you're going to use. I'm fine with that, really I am. As to whether you need to spend £259, it's £275 list price, £259 in the real world, to buy this motherboard, or a similarly high-end motherboard from another maker, I'm less certain about that. If you're simply going to overclock your processor to a sensible level that where you're approaching the thermal limit of the processor, you're not really stressing the motherboard particularly hard. That's the fact of the matter. The processor is going to be the limiting factor. If you're going to put this in the heart of your new PC, you'll be happy. If you're basically treating all the extra features as insurance, so for example the USB 3.1 Gen 2 header, you don't need it today but you might want it tomorrow, yeah, okay, that's absolutely fine. In terms of support for future processors, we have no clue what Intel has planned next. We have no clue whether this will work with the 9th gen Intel processors in the fullness of time. We have simply no idea. So on that one, you're going to have to take a leap of faith. But as things stand, if you want a solid motherboard that does everything that you want but costs a fair amount of money, the Z370 Aorus Gaming 7 is very good indeed and has very few negative points. If you like this video, thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. If you want more from Kit Guru, click to subscribe. I'm Leo Walder for Kit Guru. This is the Z370 Aorus Gaming 7.